Heather and Bret, are you here? They're there. Come on up. There we go. Heather Hine, Bret Weinstein. Yeah. So good to have you both. We're going to have a live version of the Dark Horse podcast here. Bret, I think I'll just open up with you. I have my preferred topics. I kind of want to dig into, have you looked on your podcast, have you looked into this RSV controversy about the monoclonal antibodies and all the work that was done on that? You've not examined that yet.
Haven't gotten there yet.
Okay. Yeah, you're going to enjoy this one. All right, let me just then broaden it out, unless you want to go more specific, and I'll just leave it to both of you and let you both talk. Concerning, this is an absurd question. The most common errors in science today, or let's narrow it down in the science that affects us all, which is concerning shot efficacy and otherwise, and some of the most hidden things. Maybe you can help us find them, because I think you two have mastered that art. And by the way, thank you for your work for the last 5 years. I mean.
Thank you for running the coolest refugee camp anywhere.
Second that.
So you've asked a question that actually has an easy answer. The most common mistake in science, and it doesn't matter which science we're talking about, is not doing science, which is incredibly easy to do. And in fact, it is what you end up doing if you start optimizing for the academic rat race. If you're going to win the rat race, it's because you're skimping on the stuff that makes science actually work, which is why we now have an academy that is entirely Potemkin, department after department, saying things that it claims to know are true. The people in those departments may even believe they're true, but they don't stand up to even the most minimal amount of scrutiny. So scientific method is ancient. We know how to do it. And it doesn't matter how scientific the thing you're doing looks. If you're not doing the method in the correct order, honorably, what comes out of it is not robust. And we've seen this. We've now seen this proven in psychology. The replication crisis established that more than half of what psychologists thought they had established through experiment could not be done in another experiment. And if you expose the other disciplines to that same kind of scrutiny, you will find the same thing. The academic rat race causes you to skimp on the science, and it doesn't work.
I agree completely. And I would add, science is for everyone. Science is humanity's birthright. We can all do it. We all should be doing it. We all can do it. Even if we had some terrible science teacher in 3rd grade and we're informed that we can't do it, we can. And what is passing for science now is so often anti-science and explicitly reductionist. It mistakes data for hypothesis. It confuses conclusion for hypothesis. Again, that at least half the country seems to have been compelled that what you do with science is you follow it. And that's not something you can do with science. That's proof that people who are saying that don't actually know what it is. And like I said, it's everyone's birthright. We all can be and should be doing it ourselves.
And if I can bring it back to the Brownstone mission, or what I understand that mission to be, this is all well and good when you're fighting over whether or not the Big Bang explains the universe, right? That may be a very deep and important question at one level, but your health doesn't depend on it. When this started to intersect with questions about what, for example, happens when you hijack cells by injecting mRNA into them and triggering them to produce a foreign protein, people had gotten used to signing up on a scientific team, right? And I'm with those people who believe in the Big Bang, and we reject whatever other model. But the problem is they hurt themselves in such large numbers by accepting these claims that were not scientifically robust, that for one brief moment, people were awake, that maybe what they believed mattered materially, that it manifested itself in their health or maybe even their capacity to live another day. So that opportunity, the fact that people saw enough injury come from signing up on the wrong team, that they are now willing to contemplate these questions is profoundly important. And I think Brownstone is doing a better job than anybody at not letting COVID go.
Well, I will say that we've all been kind of a part of a 5-year-long seminar in understanding what's wrong with the establishment, the scientific establishment, and what's wrong with these papers. I've treated it to some extent. I've gamified it at this point. I'll pull up a paper that has an implausible conclusion. I'll just give you an example. The states that locked down less had more death from COVID than those that locked down more and earlier. Okay, that's not really a believable. Okay, let's say if it's true, then you have to show me it's true. But I'm already alert to the likelihood that it's not true, and then you dig into the paper, and it just jumps out at you immediately that they start dating it in, say, April of 2020. Okay, thereby missing the biggest wave of death from the most lockdown states. So they've already excluded something that would falsify the core theory, right? So that's just one example. Go ahead.
Well, you said you gamified it. I would say this is the way to do it, actually. And it reminds me of something I used to do when I was a professor, where I would collect hard copies of academic journals that I actually respected and that often published real things. And I would hand them out to the students and say, each of you find 3 articles in this one issue of this one journal and describe to me what you see there. And sometimes these were freshmen, sometimes these were 5th-year seniors, but almost always what they found, first they didn't believe because they thought they weren't capable of seeing what was actually there. And over time they could see, oh, there's fraud. There's fraud everywhere. In every scientific journal, even the ones that are also publishing good science. And
what years were these that you were teaching this?
We were professors from 2002 through 2017.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you prepared your students well for what came after, I guess.
Well, yes and no, because we've also gotten what I would call a graduate education in, among other things, scientific fraud through COVID, where we've learned how all these tricks work. And in fact, one of the things that I think people need to understand is that pharma perfected a game that it was engaged in 24/7, 365 for I don't know how many decades. Most of us knew that there was a problem with pharma, that the drugs were more likely to have side effects that mattered, that they weren't being completely honest with us. But we didn't realize the extent to which they had become virtuosos playing the system, right? And that this was resulting in...
They built the system and played it. They owned the system.
They owned both sides of the system. Yeah. And so when we got to COVID and suddenly everybody was wondering what the heck is going on, we started painfully discovering these tricks.
Right.
And, now you can look at this and you can figure out which 7 of these things are being employed to sell you some nonsense that's going to hurt you, and you won't know how it did until 2 decades from now. But they knew it. They had become experts at it.
And one of the things that was actually magical in a positive way about the early days of COVID was that it was the Wild West with regard to academic publishing.
Yeah.
The preprint servers were out of control in a good way. That There was just endless research at first before it mostly got taken down. And that meant that even if you weren't an institution, you could access all the research that was being done briefly if you were willing to wade through the swell. And there's always a lot of swell, but all you had to do was go look. Whereas usually what's between you and the research are the peers. And the peers, of course, are not necessarily peers at all, but peer review keeps a lot of good science out of the public.
Uh-huh.
So I wanted to highlight some different categories, okay? Because you have outright fraud, where something is just simply presented that didn't happen in the lab, manufactured data or something like that. You've got de facto fraud.
And we had plenty of that, right? I mean,
plenty.
Sturgisphere and so on. Right.
Yeah, but that's less common than using some kind of sleight of hand that takes something and would make it very difficult to prosecute it as a fraud, but it amounts to a fraud, right? So examples of this would be redefinitions of terms. We've seen the term placebo destroyed so that you can claim you've done a placebo-controlled test and everybody assumes they know what that means. And the answer is it doesn't mean a damn thing, right? It means you had two groups that got different stuff, but what the stuff was in the control group would make your jaw drop if you knew what it was. There's also the issue of, the famous result. I forget how many people are claimed to have been saved by the mRNA shots, globally is 17 million or something like this. You know what that is? That's the result of a computer model. Completely unjustified to claim a result based on a computer model. You could legitimately run a computer model and you could hypothesize based on some pattern you saw in the model, but now you need to go compare it to actual real world evidence. The computer model on its own is nothing. It's not science. So is that fraud? It's de facto fraud. But then the last category is the most pernicious because you can't detect it, right? Heather and I can go and look at it and say, oh, this is a model. Of course it is. That's how the trick is done here.
Right.
But in the case that somebody collects a huge data set, not knowing what they're looking for, and they see a pattern, right? And then they claim that they were running a hypothesis test looking for that pattern. In other words, what they've done is the scientific method out of order. What they really have is an observation. They've disguised it as a hypothesis test. There is no way that Heather or I or anybody else can look at that paper and see that that's what happened. We are trusting that you did it in the right order. And if you didn't do it in the right order, no science happened. You've got step one. You've got observation, period. Now what do you need? Hypothesis, prediction, test, right? You're still in need of those things. But if you did it in that order, if you did all of those steps, how far behind your peers are you in their academic rat race, right? You're 3 steps behind. The person who cheated is going to have another publication on their record. You're still doing, step 2. So, of course, we get endless papers that superficially appear to be right, except they don't report the steps in the order they were actually done.
Yeah, that's true in the social sciences too. I mean, economics, it's famous. Yeah, you just run regressions all day until one starts flashing, and then you come up with a theory around it, and then you prove the theory based on the one and 15,000 regressions you ran that happened to show a significant positive correlation. Then are we allowed to kill bugs here? Oh, yeah.
That's an invasive, yes. You can kill that one. In fact, it is morally good to kill that one, believe it or not.
So the others are, they're getting, the models are easy, but they're getting more difficult. And causation, correlation, these are the simple tricks, right? But they're getting more difficult, especially with pharmaceutical products when they're dividing the test groups in ways that hide signals. I mean, that one blew me away. That was the one that was discovered recently.
Oh, and the highly complex tests with multiple arms where there's, they're moving the dates at which they're collecting data. So, I mean, again, here's a trick you need to know. Randomized controlled trial. Is it the gold standard of evidence? Well, in one way, yes, and in another way, no. It's the gold standard of evidence because a properly structured randomized controlled trial is excellent at taking a very subtle effect and showing it. That's its strength. It can find a very subtle effect. But it is highly sensitive. It is equally sensitive to structuring the test in an incorrect way so that it spits out a false signal. So if you're interested in gaming the system, if you're not really interested in health being the product of the system, but profits being the product of the system, then randomized controlled trial is a gold mine because all you have to do is subtly alter the way you did the test, who's in the control group, which thing applies to what arm, and you can get whatever result you want, and the public is none the wiser. So all of this depends on the method section being correctly structured, it being an honest representation of what was done, and there is no way in a system that is effectively the honor system that you can know that that's what happened.
And even then, if your data set is at all complex, you're probably using models in your statistics because it's very
even with
rare.
RCTs?
With RCTs, with anything, really, because it's the very rare piece of modern science that has a simple enough experimental design that the scientists themselves can run their own stats, certainly not on the back of an envelope, but even using statistics that they can themselves generate and assess, which means that almost never, even the honest, good-hearted scientists who are trying to do good work, who have generated a hypothesis, figured out an experimental design, collected the data, are then feeding their data into a model. And they're trusting that they have not broken any of the assumptions of the tests.
Yeah, and that the model's robust, that it's using the right method of statistical analysis and that sort of thing. And a lot of these models that they're using are decades old and codified industry standards, but not really examined. Back on the RCT issue, I guess it was during the COVID period, because I hadn't really paid attention to a lot of this, I don't know, the sociology of science until COVID. But then everybody's screaming there's only one true way of knowing anything, only one way to access valid information, and that's a randomized control trial, And those are very expensive, for one thing. It's an expensive way to gain knowledge. Meanwhile, you had on the ground all these medical doctors having actual real-world experience with patients, and they're being shouted down.
But that's just anecdote, Jeffrey.
Yeah, it's just anecdote. That's just a weird story you're telling. It's not showing up in the RCT.
Well, as you know, I'm very much aligned on your mission to keep COVID alive until we figure out what happened. I really think it's nobody wants to talk about it anymore. I mean, maybe this audience is exceptional. You're still paying attention.
Well, we're talking about more now than we were, even 2 years ago. I mean, it's a bigger. The headline of the Washington Post today is about this subject. So,
well, we're not talking about it enough, though, because we got the best glimpse we're ever going to get at how the system works. And so we don't know what the topic is going to be next time, but we have to figure out, based on what we did learn about COVID, what happened that we don't yet know about. And there are a lot of things lurking there, right? That people have not yet figured out the repurposed drug thing, right? The public has caught up to the fact that the virus was enhanced in a lab. They know that the shots were not safe. Most of them know that the shots weren't at least nearly as effective as they were told, maybe not effective at all. But the repurposed drug thing is still a place where people are confident that ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine looked promising, and then it turned out they didn't work, which is absolute nonsense. But the question is, why was that important? And there are multiple levels of the answer. Heather and I were initially convinced that it had to do with the EUA, that you weren't able to have an EUA if there were alternatives. But that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny because the power of pharma is so great that surely it could have gotten around that the way it got around everything else. So the real value of getting rid of those things, I suspect, was the pandemic had to be frightening, right? They redefined pandemic, for one thing, so that it did not involve severity, right? Because the public can't keep track of the fact that severity and contagiousness are two separate parameters, and that a highly contagious something isn't necessarily scary. A cold is highly contagious, right? So you can't have a cold pandemic, can you? Well, now you can. But COVID had to be scary enough that we would be begging for the shot when they came out with it. And in order for it to be scary enough, you couldn't very well have doctors experimenting with protocols based on the symptoms of the people who walked through their door, because they all would have discovered what the courageous doctors that we all know did find out, which is that, there are perfectly viable drugs that are very safe, very well known, they're not expensive, everybody can have them, and they turn COVID into a perfectly manageable disease in just about everybody. So in light of that, there'd be no excuse to lock us down, and there'd be no excuse to force everybody into a shot. So we don't know that for sure, but I suspect that's why that weird issue popped up the way it did. They needed the public to have no alternatives, and that meant they had to override your doctor.
Yeah, they didn't want other means. That sounds right to me. They did not want any other means of getting well. They just didn't want. And by the way, I did not understand at the time. We issued the Great Barrington Declaration in October. It's coming up, soon. The 5-year anniversary of that thing. I could not understand what was so objectionable about that document. I mean, when it came out, it was like this earthquake. all the powers of the state, were deployed to censor it, refute it, shut it down, denounce the guys who signed it, to discredit the thing. By the way, Lou Eastman is here. He's the one who ran the website. So he was on the front lines of this. It was a very plain statement. It didn't really say anything particularly, amazing. It just said, well, it's a pandemic, a respiratory pandemic. We'll get over it through exposure in domesticity. It's not really a danger to most working age people, certainly not to healthy and not at all to kids. So everybody should just kind of go back to being normal. And if you're vulnerable, then be careful as you would in any flu season. That's what it said. I didn't understand why it was so frenzied. It took me 3 or 4 years to realize what the actual problem with it was, that it said that there were other means of getting through this besides the shot. It said something about, it was not anti-vax. It said, we're going to get a vaccine, but it didn't say, but it was not a vaccine-only document. It just said, we're going to get through it through exposure and through herd immunity, what they called herd immunity, which comes in domesticity, which comes through exposure. That was the problem. And that came out a month before the shots were released.
Well, another clue, really, I think the whole thing turns out to have been quite diabolical. Somebody was okay with causing a huge amount of death and destruction and the evaporation of a tremendous amount of wealth. And that is disturbing in its own right. But really, something as mild as the Great Barrington Declaration, and as sensible and straightforward and based on the common knowledge in the field of epidemiology, was that if it was true that you had to accept this document because it made sense, then this was obviously a discussion about what makes sense, in which case the whole pandemic narrative falls apart. So somehow, field after field had to accept that whatever it knew a year before was no longer valid, and nobody was allowed to even acknowledge that they did all agree on something before that was now no longer tolerated. So you had, and this goes back to what Robert Malone was talking about this morning, the utilitarian problem is serious, because utilitarianism superficially is actually a pretty good description of what government should generally do, right? Greatest good for the greatest number is not a bad rule of thumb for what policy should accomplish. However, if you follow it to its logical conclusions, it can justify anything right up through slavery, right? You can enslave a small number of people for the majority to benefit. That's perfectly justified. And what happened in the pandemic is an agreement that we had in 1947 that we all have a right to informed consent, and that doctors who violate informed consent are actually committing a hanging offense. We hanged 7 doctors in 1947 for violating informed consent before it had even been formalized, right? Somewhere between 1947 and 2019, the agreement on informed consent apparently evaporated, and public health was granted the right to override the individual's ability to have and exercise informed consent. We never had the discussion, but somehow by the time 2019 rolls around, public health stages a coup against medicine, right? Your doctor is not allowed to have a conversation with you about what's in your interest. A public health authority is in a position to tell your doctor what they are and are not allowed to acknowledge. And that is frightening.
I wanted to go back for a moment to the question of fear and how fear was used to get an entire population to do someone's bidding. And in part, fear only works in that way with certainty. It has to come with a certain amount, with a lot of certainty. We know this is true. We have the answer for you. Therefore, no repurposed drugs. Therefore, only our answer. If you believe in this virus, then the only solution is this vaccine, et cetera. But it's that certainty that the very fearful were embedded in. And so we heard things like, don't ask questions. Questions are dangerous now. This is not the moment for that. This is not the moment for skepticism. And of course, it is always, almost, the moment for skepticism. Certainty is maybe the biggest enemy in this, that if we all can, I think, moving forward, be it avian flu or climate or whatever it is that comes next, when we hear someone speaking with absolute assurance that this is what is true, we can say to ourselves, I need to know what the alternative position is.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's true. Maybe I don't even have an assessment right now of which.
By the way, we do that every day at Brownstone, right? I mean, I'm not
Exactly.
You know, if somebody comes announces some great new dogma, you know, they've got all the answers to everything. I'm already, you know, pulling back and like, well, I don't know. Let's talk about Bret. Back to your point, or Heather, either way. I'm a little skeptical about your claim that somehow the mandates were baked into the plan from all the way from 2019, because you know we know that back in February 2020, the Yale School of Public Health came out with the first draft of what became the Great Barrington Declaration. You know, I mean, they said, don't lock anybody down, don't use the heavy hand of the state. We'll get through this normally. That was basically what they said, and this was in the middle of February 2020. Of course, they reversed themselves a month later, and then they were all for lockdowns, blah, blah, blah. But the shots came out, in middle of November. By middle of January, they're widely available to everybody. The mandates didn't come along till later, and I've always assumed, I always thought I mean, you're making a suggestion that the mandates were part of the scheme from the beginning. My assumption has always been that the problem is that people didn't want these stupid things. They didn't want to take the potions. They didn't feel like they needed it. And so then but they wanted 90%. They wanted more customers, basically.
I think we genuinely don't know, but my impression is they were baked in somewhere. Somebody understood what was going on, but I don't think everybody was on board. There was a process of coercion that caused all of the disciplines to start marching in lockstep, but there was also this period in which, you know, there literally wasn't a memo. So people had to figure out when they were supposed to sideline their professional instincts and just, you know, dispense the received wisdom. And, you know, in fact, most of the names that we know of the dissident doctors and scientists are people who, when that happened, that process was like a wave that washed over all of these disciplines, and almost everybody fell into lockstep. And then every so often you have a Pierre Corey who's like, well, wait a minute, what? Right? I'm sorry, but this is not making sense based on what we all knew a year ago, right? So we really have to go into things like, you know, the banality of evil. We need to look at what is understood about propaganda, about the Milgram experiment, maybe even the Stanford Prison experiment. But there's something that causes human beings to align and adopt a modality that has nothing to do with analytical conclusions, has to do with much more primal stuff. It has to do with fears and incentives. And I believe somebody did understand this, and that the plan, let's put it this way, the pressure that Heather and I felt when we started to wake up about the shots, and just for those of you who weren't following at the time, we accepted at face value that the shots were probably as effective as we were being told. That was obvious nonsense in retrospect. What threw us was the fact that we were being told not only are they effective, but they're safe. And the key thing about the claim that they were safe is that
You could not know that.
it was by definition a lie, right? All you needed to know in order to spot that that was a lie was that the shots were new, that they had not been deployed in a large population, which means there was a risk. Even if they turned out to be perfectly harmless in the beginning of 2021, there would have been a risk that they weren't harmless. Therefore, to tell me that they're safe means you're lying to me for some reason. You're violating my informed consent. So that woke us up, and then the more you looked, the stupider the story was, the worse the data was, right? So I do think, for some reason, the pressure that those of us who resisted got said they wanted a shot in every arm for some reason that we still don't know. It was not going to be enough to have it be an overwhelming majority. It had to be everybody. Maybe that's because they didn't want a control group, right? If you've got a shot that you want normalized, if you want the mRNA platform normalized because you've got 100 different shots you'd like to deploy, you can't get them through safety testing because they're too goddamn dangerous. You want everybody to have taken them during the emergency so that there is no control group, so that you can't spot the harm of the mRNA because it's in a sea of other people who've had different mRNA shots, right? So was that the plan? I don't know, but it's at least a good match for the behavior that said we can't allow exceptions.
That would actually account in part for why the demonization of the communities that had hardcore resistance, like the Hasidim and the Amish, that were subjected to grotesque levels of attack.
I interviewed an Australian woman who had a terrible history of sensitivities. When we were all told you have to get the shot because there are people who can't, she was the type specimen of somebody who can't have this shot, right? And they were forcing her to get it. It was so bad, she was literally already known to be allergic to, I think it was the polyethylene glycol in the shot. So they were telling her she needed to get a shot that contained an ingredient that had already caused her to go into anaphylaxis. What did they say she should do about that? Have an EpiPen, right? So in what universe do you not let this person off the hook, right? They couldn't even allow her off the hook. And that just told me there is something unnatural about their need to get this into every arm. And it does raise another important question, which is, did they take it? I don't think so. Because I think as much as, there may be vast numbers of people inside of Pfizer who are true believers, but the people at the very top understand the game they're playing. They knew this wasn't safe as well as we did. So I don't know how the magic trick was done. Did they take a different shot? Did they take no shot? Was this what the DNA shots were for? Who knows? But we really need to get to the bottom of that question. It will tell us a lot about what game was played on us.
Yeah, I think we're probably likely going to get to the bottom of that particular one. We're going to find out who got what shots and whether there was a special shot manufactured for insiders.
Are you kidding? I'm hoping you're not.
No.
You think we're going to get to the bottom of that?
We're going to find out. Yeah.
Oh, that will be a beautiful moment.
We're going to get. Well, we know in New Zealand there were for sure.
So Jessica is pointing out that we do know that there were special lots distributed inside of pharma, but that I think was for the rank and file. I want to know about the C-suite, and I want to know this across all of their shots. Did the kids of the families in the Pfizer C-suite, do they get the CDC schedule? I'm thinking they don't, right? And that would be explosive to know. If you knew that, then we'd be having a whole different discussion, wouldn't we? So I think we should be pursuing that information.
Well, and the other question that I kept asking myself for so long is, it's funny that you said you took their word for it that the shot wouldn't work, and that's great. I have a very beginner's level knowledge of virology, and I knew for sure that you cannot vaccinate your way out of a respiratory pandemic. The virus moves too fast. It changes shape too quickly.
It evolves too fast. Not only is it a respiratory virus, but it's single-stranded RNA.
And it's got a zoonotic reservoir. So
right.
How do you vaccinate?
What's more, you're vaccinating them in the arm, and what you need is a robust mucosal immunity. So we learned all of these things.
Yeah, all these things.
Yeah.
So the thing that amazed me about it, and I confronted an FDA official about this question, why would you risk the reputation of an entire industry, or actually all industries, based on the workability of a potion that you probably know going into it is not going to actually achieve the thing? Why would you do that? And the answer that was given back to me was, in order to deploy a new technology.
I think it was about that, but they screwed up, right? And I don't actually think that they screwed up in claiming that they could control a pandemic that they couldn't. I think if they had deployed something, if they had effectively gone, some of you are going to need to forgive me for this, but homeopathic on the actual material, and they had given a shot that was overwhelmingly just saline so that it really wasn't doing a lot of harm. If they had done that, then they could have faked the data and claimed
That's
the
right.
pandemic lifted because of their marvelous new invention, and then they could have deployed the mRNA for whatever they wanted. It would not have destroyed the control group, though, which is why. So my feeling is strategically they screwed up, right? If they're as cynical as they appear, they should have deployed an inert shot and then claimed victory. They would have won. I don't know that we'd be sitting here if they did that. We would look like fools. But instead, they deployed a shot that hurt so many people that it's unignorable, right? And that actually awakened a large number of people, and it made the conversation possible. So, again, that leaves us with a question. Why didn't they do the smart thing in this case if it was just to get this technology normalized?
Well, and it's not just one they, because the amount of active ingredient in the Pfizer and the Moderna shots were so wildly different. So it's possible that they couldn't agree between themselves, but was it Moderna was a way higher load than the Pfizer shot, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
So
Interesting.
So it wasn't even an option.
Well, the two of you are try to maintain some touch with the what we might call the public mind. You know, the spirit of the times, the orthodoxy, the cultural, social, scientific orthodoxy of the moment. The story that they wanted to tell going into this whole thing was, we locked down the population for an implausibly long time. That saved a lot of lives. Then we deployed the great solution, and that fixed the problem. And now we're heroes, okay? So that was the story they wanted to tell. And that story has been, people keep trying to tell that story over and over. You see it every day, like in the New York Times, right? They just assert,
and you know it's true if you just look at the models. I mean, the number of people who were saved was astronomical.
So that has bothered me from the very beginning, that if that is the story, we will never get back our freedom, right?
Well, except that they hurt people. That's
the question. I mean, is that story? I know that they're still trying to push it. How widespread is that story now? My impression is that it's not widely believed, that there are some people who still believe it, but
I think we get back to the question discussed this morning of what percentage of New York Times readers are true believers, right? It's whatever that number is, they still believe it. People in our families still believe that story. There are a lot of people who still believe what we were told in the end of 2020 is true, was going to be true. It was the promised land. We have arrived. So it's too many. And yet the question for me is, it's not everyone. So how do we write the different story? How do we write the different narrative and get that to catch on and become, the new myth that is true?
That's right. That's the question I keep asking myself. How do we write that different story? How do we drive it home? Because if we don't have a different story, we're going to be in trouble. And by the way, we're in a rare situation in this country because we have so much doubt and skepticism. Also, we have people in power right now that are actively dismantling. I mean, let's face it, until Jay got control of the NIH, the official plan for the future was to always lock down until vaccination. That was the plan. Always lock down until vaccination for everything, real or imagined, forever. Now, Jay has, destroyed that, but we're one of the few countries that has. I mean, we shouldn't forget. There were 195 countries that locked down for COVID. So most of those countries are planning to do it all over again.
Well, I think the question of what people believe is unfortunately not a simple one, because people can hold one belief and then you can see revealed preference in things like, well, how many people are actually getting their COVID boosters? And the answer is almost nobody's getting their COVID booster. How many people are getting a flu shot? Oh, it's down. How many people are questioning their doctors about the CDC schedule for children? So people are a lot more awake than they were. It is disturbing, though, that people will not own up to how awake they are. And I think they genuinely they're doing some trick where they haven't made eye contact with their doubts about the harm they did to themselves, about their fear about doing further harm, because their hope is, well, COVID is a memory now. And they don't realize that this whole time, pharma has been reformulating shots on the mRNA platform. They've got advanced versions of it that are self-replicating, even more terrifying than what they were delivering during COVID. And that their plan clearly is to turn mRNA into the new profit center using tricks like claiming that, well, the platform has been tested against a placebo, don't you know? Yeah. So we've got a new shot. The only thing different in it from the last shot is the mRNA transcript. Let's test that and see if that's harmful. Lo and behold, it's not. I guess the shot's safe. And so the point is you're just going to see a proliferation of these things. And there's going to be all kinds of things that they need you to get the shot in order to participate in. So all of this talk about CBDCs and vaccine passports, this is not an idle consideration. This is clearly somebody steering us into a condition where we have to do what they say, and what they say includes taking gene therapies, right? In fact, they tried to get the WHO to have that power. They literally tried to write it into the WHO charter so that the director could declare an emergency and declare what vaccinations you needed to take, and your own nation couldn't override it. They literally tried to do this. So we know what they're planning, and if people will make eye contact with that and understand that to try to put COVID behind them and not think about it anymore is to invite this to happen again and again. They're not done with you, right? Once you know they're not done with you, then it becomes a lot easier to look at what they've already done and say, wait a minute, never again.
Yeah, and again, just to emphasize the point, I always want to stay appreciative of the fact that we have this, what could turn out to be a brief moment right now, where we have our friends in power who are dedicating 16 hours a day and taking enormous risks to themselves, to their lives also, and careers, to dismantle this stuff before it seizes control of us. But this is an unusual situation globally. It's a different situation. I mean, that the orthodoxy of what became the orthodoxy of 2020 is still with us, and we could bounce back very quickly, I think.
So, I just heard someone say, "Why mRNA?" And one answer to that, I think, is that it's so you can create a so-called antidote to a pathogen so quickly that you have a drug at the ready within days. And given that we are in the business as a species, apparently, of now engineering pathogens, we can engineer pathogens, and now we can have a drug to deal with that pathogen within days.
And we should say
doing either.
We should get better at saying modified mRNA, right?
Yeah, modified mRNA, because the modifications are where a huge fraction of the danger comes from, but not all of it.
Right, Robert? It's modified mRNA. Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. So I also wanted to take a crack at that with the awareness that it is amazing that Robert Malone is sitting in this tent structure with us. So, Robert, you call me out if I get this wrong, okay? I won't take it personally. But I think the answer to why mRNA is that the mRNA platform is an absolutely brilliant solution to a very real problem, okay? If you have the need to get a product into a cell, like let's say you've got a defective gene and it's not allowing you to make insulin and you need your pancreas to produce it or something along those lines, the ability to introduce that, basically the product of the gene that should be in your genome, into the cell and get the cells to do that work, it's a very elegant solution to a very deep problem. However, it comes with a fatal flaw. The fatal flaw, or one of several fatal flaws, is that when your body produces a protein that you yourself do not produce, your body regards the cells doing that production as virally infected, and it kills them, right? That happens in your heart. It's very bad. And the problem with the technology as they deployed it is that there's no addressing mechanism. There's no way to tell certain cells to produce this, cells you can afford to lose. So it gets haphazardly done in the body, and it's like playing tissue roulette. So the answer about why mRNA, I think, and then we're going to ask Robert if I've got it right, is that they had a brilliant solution that they couldn't deploy. They had the ultimate cash cow. And what they needed in order to deploy it was an emergency that was sufficient to get through all of the safety testing that would have revealed the harm done to the body by using the solution that they had. All right, Robert's now going to fix what I said.
And
That's a win.
the panel is out of time, but let's let Robert have the last word here.
Okay, so this comes from a gene therapy lab. It comes from a gene therapy lab in the mid to late 1980s. Gene therapy was conceived of by a pediatrician at the University of California, San Diego. And at the time when this was developed, that pediatrician, Ted Friedman, had become completely disillusioned with the logic of gene therapy. His child, his intellectual child, he realized was untenable for the very reason that Bret has just laid down. But this mRNA tech was the last resort, the last gasp effort of the massive investment in gene therapy that had been a core part of NIH's vision for its future. And all the other ones that they went through had failed. If they could have made DNA vaccines work, they would have. And in fact, the DNA and RNA tech was licensed to Merck. This is part of the story that you may not know. So what transpired, and the reason why what I did and my colleagues at Vical were shut down, is because the terms and conditions of the licensing agreement for the patents to Merck from Vical were that Merck would be allowed to take credit for the technology, literally. And so what we did was not published. That's why it's only in the patents, is because it was the terms for the licensing agreement with Merck. And Merck set up a team, and with big fanfare, there was a science paper. Margaret Liu, who was trained by David Baltimore, it kind of became assimilated by the priesthood. But as DNA vaccines, because Merck could not make RNA, basically. And so they thought it was not commercially viable. They suppressed it. They kept anybody else from working on it. They went through a series of technologies, retroviral vectors, adenoviral vectors, et cetera, Everyone failed. We still got the tail end of that with the J&J and the AstraZeneca vaccines. And they finally came to this because it was the same basic concept. You could go from gene to vaccine or from gene to therapeutic in a very simple, straightforward fashion. That was always the hope. And it always fails on this core issue, paradoxically, the immune system. And so for the industry, what this represents, the best metaphor I have is the gold rush in California in 1849. It's a totally new composition of matter, which means that all the other patent estate intellectual property relating to therapeutics and prophylactics for medical conditions can now be repatented using a new composition of matter. So for the industry, it became just a gold mine. All they had to do was take what was already known and reprocess it in this new composition of matter technology. We have a patent expert here somewhere that was talking to me earlier. He understands what I'm talking about. So it's a new composition of matter, and that means that it is a huge land grab. And that's why, yes, there's the biodefense angle that you can go quickly. But this is really the last desperate effort of the whole gene therapy logic that has failed now since the late 1970s. Enough?
Okay, fantastic. Let's thank Heather and Bret and bring up our next panelists. Thank you.